Imagine a man who could disappear into the dense swamps, tangled forests, and winding rivers of the south, a place where most would get lost, trapped, or forgotten. Yet he moved through it like a shadow, unseen, untouchable, and unstoppable. A man who, over the course of 30 long years, allegedly killed more than 200 men involved in the cruel machinery of slavery, and left no evidence behind, no fingerprints, no witnesses, no confessions. Only a trail of bodies that local authorities either dismissed as accidents or never dared investigate. They called him the River Ghost, a name whispered in fear among overseers, slave catchers, and plantation owners alike, and revered in quiet awe among the enslaved communities who knew exactly what he represented. A living symbol that even the most oppressive, most violent system of human bondage could bleed, that justice could exist, even if it came in a form the law would never condone. This is the story of Samuel, a man born into slavery, whose life began in chains, but evolved into something far beyond the comprehension of those who enslaved him. Some called him a murderer, some a phantom, and others a hero. Samuel's journey is not just a tale of survival or revenge, it's a story of cunning, patience, and an almost supernatural understanding of the land he lived in. The swamps, rivers, and forests of Georgia and South Carolina were not merely places he traveled. They were his allies, his weapons, his secret partners in a quiet war that would span decades. And yet, the question remains, was Samuel merely a man exacting vengeance, or was he a form of justice incarnate? A single individual taking on an entire system designed to crush every ounce of humanity from him and his people. The sheer scale of his actions makes you wonder how one man could operate with such precision, striking only when the oppressors were vulnerable, leaving no trail, no motive that authorities could ever document or understand. Stay with me, because what you are about to hear will fundamentally change the way you view history, the institution of slavery, and the lengths one determined person could go to fight back against unimaginable cruelty. You'll see how a nameless, faceless system of oppression, designed to erase identities and destroy families, was challenged by someone who refused to remain powerless, someone who refused to accept that fear, violence, and death were permanent. In a world where enslaved people had no legal recourse, where laws protected only the oppressors, Samuel turned the landscape itself into a tool of justice, into a weapon that allowed him to strike with deadly efficiency while remaining untouchable. And as you follow his story, you'll question what it truly means to survive, what it truly means to resist, and whether vengeance, when wielded with purpose and patience, can ever be separated from justice. To understand Samuel, to truly grasp the cunning, resilience, and terror that made him the River Ghost, we have to go back to the very beginning, back to a time when the chains of slavery were tightening, when overseers ruled with brutal efficiency, and when the seeds of revenge and resistance were first planted in the mind of a young man who would one day become legend. Samuel was sold at a young age like so many others in the coastal South, a child ripped from his family, shipped from one plantation to another, treated as property rather than a person. Yet from the very beginning, there was something in him that set him apart, something quiet, watchful, and calculating. Even as a boy, Samuel noticed things that others ignored. The way the overseers moved, their patterns, their weaknesses, the small cracks in the systems they thought were unbreakable. He learned the landscape intimately. Every swamp, every tidal creek, every pine forest and rice field became a map in his mind, a map he would later use with lethal precision. The other enslaved children noticed it too, how he seemed to see things that no one else could, how he could disappear into shadows or slip past overseers without a sound. And as he grew, Samuel began to understand something even more vital, that knowledge was power, and that the tools for justice were not necessarily weapons, but patience, cunning, and the ability to make those who wielded power feel truly vulnerable. The first story that survives, the one that spread quietly from mouth to mouth among the enslaved workers, tells of an overseer named Colquitt, a man whose cruelty was notorious, whose arrogance led him to believe he was untouchable. Colquitt would walk through the pine groves, inspecting the work, barking orders, convinced that no one would ever dare defy him. But Samuel, who had been sold to that plantation as a field hand, followed him one night, curious but deliberate, keeping his distance in the shadows beneath the trees. He observed Colquitt's habits, his patterns, noting the exact locations he preferred to inspect, the angles from which he climbed the scaffolding, the moments when he let his guard down. And then Samuel prepared carefully, silently, methodically. He loosened the bolts on the scaffolding, weakened the support beams in a way that would hold under normal conditions, but give way under a full-grown man's weight in just the right place. Every detail planned, every movement calculated, every chance of detection minimized. Abram, another enslaved worker who had been watching from a distance, saw it all unfold, hidden in the underbrush. He saw Samuel make the final adjustments, saw him step back and wait in silence. The next morning, Colquitt climbed the scaffolding to inspect the work. The wood, weakened and rigged, collapsed under his weight, sending him plummeting 20 feet to the ground. The fall broke his back, left him gasping and helpless, yet Samuel was nearby, approaching the dying overseer without a word, a shadow in the forest, a figure who seemed to exist beyond the bounds of ordinary morality. Abram never reported what he'd seen, nor did any of the other workers. Because among the enslaved, Samuel wasn't simply a killer. He was something else entirely. A reminder that the men who believed themselves invincible were, in fact, mortal. That the system of slavery, so rigid and cruel, could bleed, and that justice, however rough and terrifying, could exist in forms that the law would never condone. It was in that quiet, dangerous moment that Samuel's legend began, whispered across rice fields, along riverbanks, and through the forests of the Low Country. He became a figure of hope to the enslaved, a man who demonstrated that the hierarchy could be challenged, that cruelty had consequences, and that someone, somewhere, was watching. The stories spread slowly at first, told in hushed voices, shared in coded language, passed from one work gang to another. They called him many things: the river ghost, the man who couldn't be caught, the invisible avenger. And even as the overseers and plantation owners remained unaware of what had truly happened, Samuel's name began to echo across the plantations as a specter of fear. A reminder that the laws of the land protected only the powerful, but there were other laws, older and more primal, that could strike back when the powerful least expected it. Samuel's careful observation, his intimate understanding of the terrain, and his ability to exploit the arrogance of his oppressors set a pattern that would define his life for decades. Each act of resistance, each carefully executed vengeance, reinforced his legend, inspiring those around him and terrifying those who thought themselves untouchable. The enslaved communities, witnessing the consequences unfold yet powerless to intervene openly, began to revere him quietly, not as a murderer, but as proof that the world was not entirely controlled by the oppressors, that power was not absolute, and that even the most entrenched systems had vulnerabilities. The river ghost had arrived, and from that moment on, the coastal swamps, forests, and rivers of Georgia and South Carolina would never be entirely safe for the men who wielded cruelty without conscience. Samuel's name started to spread, whispered among the enslaved communities like a legend, a ghost in the rivers and forests of the Low Country. The story of Colquitt's fall, told in careful whispers, set the stage for a life of calculated resistance, of deaths that appeared as accidents, of a presence felt but never seen. And as Samuel moved from plantation to plantation, sold again and again like property, his reputation traveled ahead of him, shaping the fears of the cruel and inspiring quiet hope in the oppressed. Each new location, each new overseer, each new cruel hand brought another opportunity for Samuel to assert the message that he carried in silence, that justice, in its most primal, personal and terrifying form, could never be denied. By 1839, Samuel was being sold repeatedly along the coastal lowlands, moving from South Carolina to Georgia as though fate itself were guiding him through the plantations of the South. Each time he arrived at a new estate, he observed quietly, blending in, noting the routines of overseers, the complacency of plantation owners, and the vulnerability of the men who wielded unchecked power over enslaved people. For a few months, nothing happened. Samuel appeared just another laborer, a silent presence in the fields, inconspicuous, careful. But then the pattern emerged. A few deaths, strange accidents, unexplained drownings, falls, or incidents near water. Men who had tormented the enslaved, overseers whose cruelty had gone unchecked, began dying in ways that seemed natural to the outside observer, but were, in truth, the work of someone with intimate knowledge of the land, the tools at hand, and the vulnerabilities of their victims. With each act, Samuel was careful to leave no trace, to ensure that suspicion never fell upon him, and that the story of his presence could only grow in whispered fear. Word of these deaths began to ripple through the enslaved communities, spreading like a secret fire through the forests, rivers, and rice fields. Samuel was no longer simply a man. He became a symbol, a phantom, an almost mythic presence that existed just beyond the reach of the overseer's vision. He was given names that reflected the awe and terror he inspired: the river ghost, the man who could not be caught, the invisible avenger. To the enslaved, he was a hero, someone who struck back at the system that had taken everything from them, proving that cruelty could be punished, that no man, no matter how powerful, was beyond reach. And to the plantation owners and overseers, he was a nightmare they could neither anticipate nor control. Rumors of his presence spread faster than the man himself ever moved. Overseers grew anxious, inspecting every tree, every canal, every riverbank, knowing that the river ghost could strike when they least expected it. The sense of dread became palpable, altering the way plantations operated, the way owners managed their labor, and the confidence with which men exercised authority over others. Some plantation owners, unable to cope with the psychological pressure and the unpredictability of Samuel's vengeance, chose to sell their estates rather than risk further losses. Others tried to fortify their properties, hiring additional guards or private security, but even these measures proved insufficient against someone who knew every hidden trail, every waterway, every escape route that only someone who had lived as a slave could possibly understand. Meanwhile, the authorities began to take notice, though slowly. The local constables and sheriffs were often corrupt or indifferent, unwilling to expend effort on deaths that affected only the enslaved system. But by 1845, the federal government realized that there was a pattern too clear to ignore. Enter Silas Crenshaw, a federal marshal assigned to investigate the growing string of deaths that spanned multiple states. Unlike local law enforcement, Crenshaw was educated, methodical, and unafraid of pursuing evidence wherever it led. He approached the case like a puzzle to be solved, carefully reviewing court records, property transfers, and death reports. He interviewed plantation owners, physicians, undertakers, and anyone with knowledge of the suspicious deaths. Every lead was followed, every detail scrutinized, every piece of the sprawling map of terror laid out across Georgia and South Carolina examined with meticulous care. Crenshaw quickly began to see the pattern that others had ignored for years. He compiled records, noting that each death occurred near water, involved men deeply embedded in the system of slavery, and coincided with the presence of the same enslaved man moving from plantation to plantation. By his count, over 100 deaths matched the profile, and he was convinced the real number was higher. Crenshaw's determination culminated in a manhunt unprecedented for the time. He organized a detachment of armed men, brought tracking dogs from Charleston, posted guards at every river crossing, bridge and road, and offered a $500 reward, a fortune then, for any information leading to Samuel's capture. Witnesses reported seeing him at breakfast, at work, and on the paths near the plantations. But when the search parties arrived, Samuel had vanished as though swallowed by the earth itself. His cabin was empty, save for a blanket, a wooden bowl, and a spare shirt, suggesting a hurried but deliberate departure. Every attempt to track him failed, every lead went cold, and Samuel, the river ghost, remained elusive, untouchable, and increasingly legendary. And then, Crenshaw's own body was found, broken at the bottom of a ravine near the Alteraha River. His horse was a quarter-mile away, grazing calmly, his rifle unfired. The official explanation, an accidental fall while pursuing a suspect, satisfied no one who had followed the case. Those who knew the investigations understood the truth. The river ghost had struck again, eliminating the one man who had come closest to capturing him, a ghost who existed in both fear and silence. With Crenshaw gone, the federal pursuit collapsed, and no other lawman was willing to take on the task. Plantation owners stopped filing reports, newspapers ceased coverage, and the deaths continued with the same precision and patience Samuel had shown for decades. The legend of the river ghost solidified, a specter of vengeance and justice intertwined, and the coastal lowlands of the South became a haunted landscape where the enslaved whispered of hope and the oppressors trembled in the shadows. From 1846 to 1850, the killings attributed to the river ghost escalated in both frequency and intensity. What had once been isolated incidents now became a systematic pattern of terror that permeated the very fabric of the plantation system. Overseers, who had once strode confidently through the fields, began avoiding isolated areas, doubling back on themselves, and refusing to travel alone. Slave catchers, men skilled in tracking runaways and accustomed to navigating the harsh swamps of the low country, began traveling in pairs or small groups, armed to the teeth but still vulnerable to the cunning of someone who knew every hidden trail, every waterway, and every soft bank that could conceal a trap. Even private patrols, hired to guard the properties day and night, proved useless against a man who operated with the patience of a predator and the intelligence of someone who understood the limits of his enemies as well as the strength of the terrain itself. Samuel's actions were never random. They were calculated, precise, and designed not just to kill, but to instill fear, to undermine confidence in the system, and to make those who enforced it question every step, every decision, every action. The tales of these deaths became increasingly specific and horrifying. One overseer named Curtis Deer, infamous for his cruel punishments and ruthless control over the enslaved, was found drowned in a rice paddy where the water barely reached his ankles. The positioning of his body suggested he had been forced under, restrained by someone kneeling on his back, and left to struggle until life left him. The plantation owner, terrified of both the implications and the growing legend, sold the property and moved his family to Charleston, abandoning the land forever. Not long after, a wealthy Charleston merchant inspecting a coastal plantation for purchase was discovered in a tidal creek, his throat cut with surgical precision. A physician who examined the body concluded that the killer must have possessed intimate anatomical knowledge, yet no suspicion fell on any individual, and the case was quietly closed. In a single week, 3 experienced slave catchers, armed and trained to track even the most cunning runaways, disappeared while pursuing a trail in the swamps south of the Alamaha River. Search parties found no trace of them, no weapons, no tracks, nothing. As these incidents multiplied, the terror spread beyond those directly responsible for enforcing slavery. Property values began to drop as prospective buyers feared the invisible menace, overseers quit rather than face the unknown, and insurance companies refused coverage for plantations in areas where the river ghost was rumored to roam. The very economic and social systems that supported slavery began to feel the psychological weight of his presence. Yet, perhaps the most extraordinary element of this terror was the collective silence of the enslaved population. Hundreds, perhaps thousands of people had to have known something, seen something, or heard the whispers about Samuel, and yet not a single person, despite the promises of reward or threats of punishment, ever provided information that could lead to his capture. This was a community-wide code, an unspoken agreement that whoever Samuel was, he deserved protection. The river ghost was not merely a man, he was a symbol of resistance, a figure who allowed enslaved communities to believe that justice could exist outside the oppressive structures that dominated their lives. They shared knowledge in whispers, passed down in coded language, in ways that only those born into the system could understand. And while the authorities scrambled, offering rewards, sending patrols, and even deploying trained dogs, the enslaved remained loyal to the secret. Their silence was as much a weapon as the traps and strategies Samuel himself employed. Even when Samuel reappeared after periods of absence, his presence was as enigmatic and deadly as ever. Plantation ledgers from Florida in 1851 note the purchase of a man referred to simply as field hand, answering to the name Samuel, purchased from an estate sale in Georgia for $800. He remained there less than a year, yet in that short span, 4 men, 2 overseers notorious for cruelty, a slave catcher specializing in tracking runaways, and a local constable who enforced punishment on the enslaved, were found dead, all near water. Each death was officially recorded as an accident or left unexplained, yet anyone who understood the pattern recognized the unmistakable signature of the river ghost. And then he vanished again, leaving behind only rumors, fear, and a landscape forever changed by his actions. His patience was astonishing. Months, even years of inactivity were merely part of a broader strategy, allowing both the system and the individuals within it to grow complacent. And when he chose to strike again, he did so with precision, with a clear understanding of the psychological impact his actions would have on the men who relied on fear and power to maintain control. Even as the nation inched towards civil war, the River Ghost continued his silent war against the system. The tension he created was both immediate and long-lasting, altering how plantations operated, how slave catchers approached their work, and how every man embedded in the machinery of slavery viewed his own mortality. The legend grew not just because of the deaths themselves, but because of the invisible hand guiding them, the strategic mind behind the chaos, and the eerie patience that allowed one man to reshape an entire region through fear and cunning. Samuel had become more than a name. He was a shadow over the southern lowcountry, a reminder that even in the most oppressive system imaginable, resistance could exist, and that justice, however brutal, could be wielded by someone who understood the power of patience, observation, and terror. When the first shots rang out at Fort Sumter in April 1861, the South descended into a chaos unlike anything it had ever seen. Plantations that had once operated under strict schedules, overseers, and armed patrols were suddenly abandoned as white men left to join the Confederate Army. Fields that had been carefully maintained fell into disrepair. Rice paddies became overgrown, and the meticulous order that had sustained the system of slavery collapsed almost overnight. Slave patrols dissolved, members riding off to battle, leaving the landscape unmonitored and unprotected. And in that void, the River Ghost, Samuel, if that was even still his name, continued to operate with the same precision and patience that had defined his career. The war provided the perfect cover for someone who moved unseen, who struck when his enemies were isolated, distracted, or vulnerable. In the midst of military campaigns, supply lines, and chaotic troop movements, Samuel could blend seamlessly into the wilderness, the rivers, and the swamps, leaving behind nothing but bodies, silence, and whispers. Confederate authorities were overwhelmed with the logistics of war, the defense of cities, and the movement of armies, and there was no capacity to track a single man, no matter how lethal, across the lowcountry. In 1863, a Confederate colonel named Marcus Talbot wrote to his commanding officer in Richmond, describing a persistent and alarming problem among the supply lines in coastal Georgia. Over 6 months, more than 20 Confederate soldiers, pickets, sentries, and couriers had been found dead under suspicious circumstances. The deaths occurred in remote areas, always near water, always when men were alone, isolated, and vulnerable. Some soldiers were convinced that a local enslaved man was responsible, though none could identify him. They had begun to call him the River Ghost. Talbot's letter reveals the fear he inspired, the psychological terror that spread even into the Confederate ranks. Some soldiers believed the River Ghost was a myth, a story told to frighten them, but Talbot insisted the deaths were real. Each incident bore the same signature that had haunted plantations for decades: bodies near water, no witnesses, methods suggesting intimate knowledge of the terrain, and the patient, calculating hand of someone who understood fear as a weapon. Yet Talbot's request to organize a dedicated manhunt was denied. The Confederacy's resources stretched too thin. Priorities focused on massive battles and the survival of armies rather than a single invisible adversary. As the war raged on, the River Ghost's trail became nearly impossible to follow. The careful records that had documented his presence for decades, plantation ledgers, sales receipts, death certificates, ceased almost entirely. Men who might have been victims were now dying in battle, leaving no way to distinguish the hand of war from the hand of revenge. And when the Confederacy finally crumbled, surrendering at Appomattox Courthouse in 1865, Samuel's world changed once again. The South was devastated, the plantation system in ruins, and the infrastructure that had enabled him to navigate, survive, and strike at his enemies disappeared. Freedmen scattered across the lowcountry and beyond, searching for family members, work, and safety. Communities were disrupted, records lost, and the meticulous documentation that had followed Samuel's movements through decades of slavery vanished. In this turbulent, transformative period known as Reconstruction, the River Ghost simply disappeared from written history, leaving behind only the lingering fear, the whispers of survivors, and a legacy that could not be measured in documents alone. And yet, even in the absence of records, the legend endured. Among Gullah communities in South Carolina and Georgia, The story of the river ghost was preserved, passed down through generations in whispers, songs, and coded language that outsiders could never fully understand. To the descendants of enslaved people, he was not a murderer but a hero, a man who had fought back when the cost of resistance was almost certain death. These stories suggested that the river ghost's influence had survived even after the war, shaping how people thought about justice, courage, and the limits of oppression. His method, precise, patient, and merciless, had been so deeply embedded in memory that the fear he inspired continued to resonate long after his last act. And somewhere, in the fractured landscape of the post-war South, Samuel, if he survived, moved quietly, leaving behind only the faintest imprint of his presence, a shadow over a society struggling to rebuild itself. But there's one final story, whispered in gullah communities, that might tell us how the river ghost's tale ended. A story passed orally for decades, never written, never verified, and yet persistent enough to suggest that the legend of Samuel was far from finished. In the summer of 1877, 12 years after the war had ended and the South was still struggling to rebuild, a tall, stooped man arrived on foot at a small freedmen's settlement near Beaufort. His hair was white, his face lined with deep wrinkles, and his hands bore the scars of a lifetime of brutal labor, the kind only someone who had survived decades of slavery could carry. He carried nothing but the clothes on his back and a small bundle containing a blanket and a wooden bowl. His presence was cautious but deliberate, moving with the quiet confidence of a man who had spent his life observing, surviving, and striking when the moment was right. The settlers, wary of strangers in the still dangerous post-war South, observed him carefully. Word of his arrival spread quickly, and though no one approached him aggressively, everyone watched from a distance. There was something unsettling about the way he walked, the way his eyes scanned the landscape, as if the land itself spoke to him, and he alone understood its secrets. And yet, despite this unease, the elders of the settlement, the men and women who had endured slavery, who had carried the weight of chains and abuse, recognized something familiar in him, a presence that demanded respect, even without explanation. The old man took up residence at the edge of the settlement, occupying a cabin that had been abandoned for years. Within a week, he had repaired the roof, patched the walls, and made the small structure habitable, working silently and efficiently. He did not attend community gatherings, did not participate in church services, and did not socialize with the younger residents, who found his presence unnerving. Yet, despite his isolation, he became part of the settlement's rhythm, tending a small garden, fishing in the nearby creeks, and moving with the coiled energy of someone who had lived a life constantly on alert. There was a gravity about him, a quiet strength that could not be challenged, and the older residents treated him with a reverence born from experience. They did not ask questions about his past, and he did not volunteer answers, yet his history seemed written on his hands, in the set of his shoulders, in the precision of his movements. The younger people whispered among themselves, speculating about who he might have been, but the elders simply watched and nodded in quiet acknowledgement. One warm evening, a group of younger men sat around a fire at the center of the settlement, speaking of the plantations of their youth, of cruel overseers, and of the injustices they had endured. One of them, a man named Isaiah, recounted the story of Thaddeus Claymore, a particularly brutal plantation owner who had ruled over 260 enslaved workers with cruelty and fear. Isaiah remembered how Claymore's overseers had mysteriously died, one after another, and how the plantation seemed haunted by invisible forces. From the shadows beyond the firelight, the old man's voice suddenly spoke, calm, clear, and carrying the weight of decades. Claymore drowned in 1852, he said quietly, fell into one of his own rice canals during harvest season. They said it was an accident, but I was there. The firelight flickered across his lined face, revealing a strange, distant expression. He stepped closer to the flames, and his eyes, sharp and knowing, met Isaiah's gaze. In fact, he added, almost as an aside, you might say I helped him fall. The words hung in the night air, heavy with implication, and the group around the fire fell silent, understanding exactly what he meant, though no one dared respond. The old man's voice carried the authority of experience and justice, and in that single moment, the legend of the river ghost was confirmed without fanfare or spectacle. For the next 6 years, the old man lived quietly among the settlement, never speaking of his past again, yet remaining a symbol of resilience, patience, and retribution. He contributed when he could, mended fences, shared food, and offered silent guidance, but he remained largely separate, respected, but never fully integrated. The elders treated him with a reverence bordering on worship, understanding the depth of his resistance, the courage it must have taken to survive and to fight back for decades under the most brutal conditions imaginable. When he died peacefully in the summer of 1883, there was no dramatic final revelation, no confession of every secret he had kept. He was found the next morning by a neighbor, his body simply given to sleep after what must have been 75 or 80 years of life, much of it spent in bondage. The settlement buried him in their small cemetery, marking the grave only with a simple wooden cross. No name inscribed, no monument, yet dozens attended, singing hymns, offering prayers, and acknowledging the life of a man who had carried out justice in the shadows. His legacy endured not in documents or monuments, but in whispers, stories, and the collective memory of the community passed down through generations. The story of Samuel, whether one man or many, fact or folklore, reminds us that resistance can take many forms. That justice, when denied through official channels, sometimes manifests in the shadows, in ways the powerful never anticipate. In Gula communities, the river ghost was not a figure of fear but of hope, a reminder that courage, patience, and knowledge could outlast even the most oppressive systems. And though history may never tell us the full truth, and though official records provide only fragments, the oral traditions preserve the essence of his life, his work, and his impact. They tell us that even in the darkest times, there are those who refuse to be broken, who fight back in silence, and whose stories live on. Was Samuel one man or many? Fact or folklore? History may never tell, but the truth remains. Resistance took many forms, and sometimes justice came in shadows. As we reach the end of this story, it's impossible not to feel the weight of the river ghost's legacy. Samuel, if that was indeed his true name, was more than a man. He was a shadow moving through the landscape of oppression, a figure who defied the impossible, who turned the tools of survival into instruments of justice. Over decades, he eluded capture, struck at the heart of a brutal system, and left behind a trail of deaths that no one could fully explain. And yet, in the eyes of the enslaved communities he moved among, he was not a monster. He was hope. Proof that even when bound by chains, when humanity is denied, courage and strategy could carve a path toward vengeance, toward a form of justice the system could never provide. The river ghost reminds us that history is often written by the powerful, by those who seek to erase the acts of resistance, and that the stories of those who fought back sometimes survive only in whispers, in coded language, in the quiet memories passed from one generation to the next. And so, we are left to ponder the questions that history cannot answer. Could one man truly have killed over 200 men and vanished into the rivers, swamps, and forests of the American South without leaving a single trace? Or was the river ghost not one man, but many, a symbol of collective resistance that the enslaved communities sustained for decades, a story that gave them courage and gave the oppressors fear? We may never know if Samuel died peacefully in that small freedman settlement in 1883, quietly tending his garden, fishing in the creeks, and living out the remainder of his years in obscurity, or if he disappeared into the swamps, returning to the shadows where he had spent most of his life, becoming one with the land he knew so intimately. What is clear, however, is the message he left behind, that even in the darkest systems, even when the law and society are structured to crush, dehumanize, and erase people, there are always those who refuse to be broken. There are always those who find ways to resist, to fight back, and to assert their humanity. The river ghost challenges us to see history not only through the lens of oppression, but also through the lens of resistance, of courage, and of the hidden acts that shape the lives of countless people. It reminds us that power is never absolute, that fear can be wielded by those the system seeks to control, and that sometimes justice finds its way outside the rules, outside the records, and into the memory of those who witness it. So, what do you think? Was the river ghost truly one man, a tactical genius navigating the waterways and forests of the Low Country for 30 years? Or was he a collective symbol, a manifestation of the courage and defiance of generations of enslaved people whose actions were never recorded, never recognized, but nonetheless shaped history in profound ways. Could you imagine living in a world where the very system designed to oppress could be turned against it, silently, relentlessly, and without ever being caught? And where does that leave us when we realize that these stories, buried in oral histories and fragments of records, are often more revealing than official accounts? If this story fascinated you, challenged your understanding of history, or left you with chills at the thought of a man, or men, moving unseen through the South, then there's so much more waiting for you. Stories like the River Ghost are scattered across time, hidden in the shadows, and waiting to be uncovered. So, make sure you subscribe, hit the notification bell so you never miss an upload, and share this video with someone who craves the hidden, the mysterious, and the histories that force us to question what we thought we knew. The past is never as silent as we think, and sometimes the shadows speak louder than the record books.